Okay, then a very warm welcome to our late night show. I have to disappoint you, I'm not Harald Schmidt, my name is Werner Hoffmann, but anyhow I will be very happy to serve as the moderator for this evening. Obviously we choose a very interesting topic. That's the only reason why so many people actually show up at this time of the day. So we're really happy and very thankful to you that you all skip all these very important receptions and prefer to be with us. So we really appreciate that. And of course, we feel the obligation to make this time a worthwhile investment for you, actually, by providing us you with some novel insights. The topic, I think, is a fascinating one for sure. It's Innovation 101, the diversity factor, and the basic idea is to explore the relationship between diversity and innovation. This is definitely a very up-to-date topic. We want to discuss things like what are the most important aspects of diversity? Is it really all about gender, or are there also other aspects and dimensions of diversity that may count? How is and why does innovation drive diversity drive innovation? Is this particularly important in the digital economy? And I'm really glad that we have a worldwide recognized expert also in digital economy with us this evening. Are there limits to diversity, or is it just the more the better? Or maybe are there also downsides to diversity and firm performance? And I think most important for you as practicing managers of business organizations, public sector organizations, not-for-profit organizations, what are the do's and don'ts in managing a diverse workforce from your perspective? That's what we want to cover. I'm really very happy and very grateful to the organizers that we have a highly distinctive panel and group of speakers for this evening. I will introduce them to you in a sequential way, just starting with Annabelle Gawer. To my, I was told Annabelle Gawer is the right way to pronounce it here in our cultural context. She will give a short introduction into the topic between the association and relationship between innovation and diversity. She's professor and chair in digital economy of the University of Surrey, an award-winning research which just talked that we both went to the Academy of Management last week, and I was really proud that I was presenting 3 papers with my team there, but now she told me she presented 5 papers and got 5 pieces. So that means she's much better performing than I am. I'm very happy to have you here, an expert in platform strategies, in new business models, in the digital economy, and also how this all is related to diversity. So Annabelle, without any more ado, I would ask you to take over and give us a fascinating intro in this topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Werner. Thank you very much, Werner, for a very generous introduction. And I am delighted to be with you tonight and in this beautiful Austrian countryside with the beautiful weather we have outside. Even more grateful that you are taking the time to be with us tonight. I was asked to speak and provide an introduction on the topic of how diversity impacts innovation. I am currently a professor in digital economy at the University of Surrey in England, which is about 30 miles, 35 kilometers south of London. And throughout my academic career, which I started more than 20 years ago, I have mostly worked in male-dominated environments. I started as an engineer and a student of mathematics in France, which is where I come from. I worked as an engineer in telecommunication in a large corporation, which is now called Thales, at the time Thomson CSF, providing military electronics to corporations and armies in the world. And I remember when I was a much younger professional that when people called my office and I picked up the phone, when they heard a female voice, they used to say, you are obviously the secretary of Mr. Gawer. Could I please speak to Mr. Gawer? And so it was a little bit strange to me because I did not expect this type of response when I was 22, 23-year-old. And nevertheless, I live surrounded by men, and I love men. I have 3 of my children here, and they're all of my children. They're all boys, and my husband is here as well. So I come in peace. And, and so I'm delighted to try to tease out a little bit what are the big issues around diversity and innovation. And for those of you who cannot make it for even 10 minutes, let me tell you what I'm going to tell you. The first thing is diversity is great for innovation. And I'm going to give you some examples as to why we are right to believe that diversity is going to be very helpful for innovation. Okay? The second thing I'm going to tell you is that despite this, we have now had for the last 10, 15 years, a lot of companies spending quite a lot of money into so-called diversity programs. And we have now enough distance with the original investment in these programs to say that actually the results from a lot of these programs seem to be a little bit disappointing. And the third point that I want to make is why? What can we learn from this? And how can we, moving forward, do things a little bit differently so that we can realize the promise of injecting various point of views and various kind of people into the process that will lead to better innovation. So that's my talk. It's good. The programs we've had lead semi-disappointing results. So what? And then my esteemed panel colleagues are going to take from there and enrich this from their different perspective. So let's start with diversity is good for innovation. What do we know about diversity and innovation to know that it's good? First of all, what are we talking about when we talk about diversity? As with many concepts, there is a lot of different definitions, but they have some things in common. Usually they include a few dimensions of diversity. One is about gender diversity. The other dimension is going to be about nationality, or sometimes in some contexts like America, race. The third one is going to come from education. The fourth one is going to come from career trajectory. And these are just 4 of the themes that we're going to talk about, okay? Now, when we talk about innovation, what are we talking about? A lot of the studies that are looking at the impact of diversity on innovation are looking at the product launches, new product launches, or new service being launched by corporations. And what these studies are measuring, in particular there is a very interesting BCG recent study on this, they are measuring the proportion of revenue for companies that comes from product launch in the past 3 years. Okay? And this BCG study shows that companies that score higher on diversity have a significantly higher portion of their revenues, 46%, coming from product or services launched in the past 3 years, compared to the 26 or so percent that is the proportion of revenue coming from new products or services from companies who self-identify as less diverse. Okay? And without being too pompous or academic, I would like to make the point that just because you see correlation between 2 situations, this happens at the same time that that happens, does not necessarily mean that there is causation or causality between A and B. Okay, so just because lots of people who are doing a search on Google on a particular word happen to be happening on the same day that there is a peak in temperature in Venezuela, doesn't mean that one leads to the other. Okay? So, but nevertheless, there is strong evidence that there is correlation between diversity, increased diversity, and increased innovation along some factors. Okay? Now, let's try to think about what I would call the micro mechanisms of that. What would be the reasons, looking with a microscope as the behavior of people and the way activities are organized within corporations to help explain this? And I will focus at 2 levels within corporation. One is the level of people who work in the process of innovation. The people in the R&D teams, the people in the development teams, and I will focus in particular about people who think about new products using the technology of design thinking. Have you heard about this word, about design thinking? It's a new way to try to come up with new products and services by trying to put yourself in the shoes of the end users. So as corporations are trying to build and sell products and services on a global stage into a variety of markets which are populated by people from all sorts of different backgrounds, it makes sense that if you incorporate into the process of product development or service development people who have similar cultures, similar preferences, similar tacit assumptions about how to use the product, when to use the product, how it could fit or not into their life, bringing people from different backgrounds, in particular cultural backgrounds, will increase the likelihood that the product or service will meet a real demand. So that's one example in which more diversity can increase innovation. Another way in which diversity can increase innovation is that we now know that one of the most important problems that companies face when they want to innovate is something called the not invented here syndrome. So there's been a lot of research showing that many engineers and scientists believe that if they have not invented this, it's probably not very, very good. And even if they wouldn't acknowledge that with word and explicitly, their behavior shows that they have a bias towards criticizing and not accepting innovation coming from the outside. So the process of innovation is fraught with blind spots and inabilities from any individual to see other ways to frame the problem. And having teams that bring in successfully different point of views helps sort out this problem. Just my last point on the point number one of the talk, which was about diversity is good for innovation, is moving from the level of the product designers and the research and development teams and the marketing teams all the way to the top management of the corporation. Studies have shown that bringing in the top management team people from a different gender and from different countries than the headquarters have a very strong effect on innovation. And if we again want to understand the micro mechanism of that, we can say that having people from different backgrounds encourages the rest of the people in the organization to think there is a future for them to grow in terms of career. It also increases the image as a modern and open-minded organization. So for the workforce as well as for the customers, there is a positive effect. Okay, so I'm finishing with part number one of my talk. Moving now to part number two, which is the effect of some of the diversity programs, in particular diversity training programs, has not been as positive as it may have been once thought. Some studies show that a lot of the diversity programs are really talking about an ideology about it's good to be diverse. As if it's an ideology that cannot really be discussed, that if you discuss it or criticize it, you come across as a reactionary person, you come across perhaps as not a very nice kind of person. And so what tends to happen is that these programs, some of these programs get rolled out, but at the end of the day, if we look at the results, first of all, in terms of, do they really increase the proportion of new hires from diverse backgrounds? Some evidence shows that actually it doesn't increase very much the number of either women or, say, there was a study about the number of black women, and that was not increased, okay? Another unintended, perhaps, consequence is that it makes most of the white males very nervous. And there is an interesting study which was realized and discussed in The Economist a couple of years ago that made an experiment and that brought in white males for hiring interviews. It was not a real corporation who was interviewing, but the candidates did not know that. And there were two groups. One was shown an advert about the company, the hiring company, that made a reference, a passing reference, but a reference nevertheless, as to the fact that this company had equal opportunities, values, and valued diversity. The other advert made no such mention. And the study measured the stress level of these white men when they interviewed, as well as asked external coders to assess the performance of the candidates. And it showed that the white males got increasingly nervous, showed physically measurable stress response as if they were under threat, and performed worse. So what we see from this type of studies is that actually there may be unintended consequences stemming from very worthwhile and legitimate goals. But where we are now is we must take stock of some of these difficulties and how can we move forward. Some of the research and the most compelling recent studies suggest that it will be worthwhile to be more open and more straightforward about the trade-offs involved into bringing diversity into the corporation. Some of the most successful corporations in the world are not diverse at all. If you think about Lego, for example, the top management comes from one little town. If you think about McKinsey, yes, there is a lot of diversity in terms of the countries from which the consultants are coming from, but once you enter McKinsey, it's like you enter a cult. There is a huge amount of homogeneity among expected behaviors, norms about how you dress, norms about how you act, norms that are constantly reinforced with retreats, family retreats, and this very homogeneous culture. Perhaps they have to be so homogeneous because people come from all sorts of different countries. We don't quite know, but what we know is that after you get to the problem-solving phase, and assuming that you actually listen to different voices without your resistance and your stress level preventing you from listening, the question of how to implement the product's development process and what is the right balance between homogeneity in the population of those who produce these products or services versus the benefits that come from the tension due to various points of view, how to truly manage those tensions in a more explicit way seems to me the way where we are in this discussion around diversity and innovation. And I would like to stop here. Thank you.
So, Annabelle, thank you very much for this, I think, very well prepared and fascinating introduction. I think you provided us with many food for thought now, and I would ask the other three panelists now to come out and take your seats at the podium. While they're coming out, I will introduce them to you. But just wait a little moment before they have taken their seats. I think from your perspective, right, to Annabelle from Austria, Silvia Buchinger. Many of you know her probably after graduating at Technical University in Vienna. I think your first appointment was Alcatel, then you moved on to Telekom Austria Group, where you were responsible for HR at the group level, and then now for some years you moved to a fascinating company we're all admiring. We all also worry a little bit because of the new ownership structure about Kuka, a fascinating German, very successful company in the fields of robotics and automation in different fields. And for sure you have to manage a very diverse workforce, and this for sure in a highly innovative culture. So very happy to have you with us because you know the local context very much and also probably have a very profound insight in this now very global and diverse setting. You have to manage all HR activities. Right to her, Juliet Bourke, you had a long way to come to us, didn't you? She comes from Australia. I'm not sure if it's not directly from Australia, but you are for sure head of inclusion and diversity with Deloitte consulting there, and also provide consulting services in these fields. Maybe you can tell us later on more about your practical experience, but that's of course fascinating for us. And I hope there are also some colleagues from Deloitte Austria here. You give you some support, and maybe also bring in an Austrian perspective in this. If this only is true for Australia, but maybe also holds for Austria. So we have to discuss this later on. Last but not least, from Germany, from Munich, also not far away, Jonathan Sierck, a fascinating young man. Maybe some of you already came across him. Very successful young entrepreneur. I asked if it's appropriate to introduce him as a life consultant. So we in German would probably say something like Lebensberater 4.0 or something like that. Might be an appropriate way to introduce him, but he will do this better on his own later on. But so I think we have a fascinating, also diverse panel here. So I'm very thankful to the organizers that they really provided me with a diverse panel discussing diversity. I will never forget Forum Alpbach some years ago when we were discussing the chances and opportunities of young people, and there was a panel of 10 people, none of them younger than 60 years. So this really felt me a little bit strange here sitting in the audience in this time. So I'm really happy that we have a diverse panel here discussing the merits and downsides of diversity. And I think now you should have the opportunity to react to what Annabelle told us. 3 to 4 minutes, your thoughts, your personal take on this topic, where you agree with her. I would even love more to learn where you don't agree with her, because discussions are always more lively if there is a certain amount of disagreement among the panelists. So Silvia, if you want to take over and share your thoughts on this topic with us.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction and happy to be here. Reaction to what you were saying. Yeah, I guess some of the topics you were mentioning, we did really invent in Kuka. So for example, the phenomenon of not invented here, we are very, very good in Germany. So, and when I was listening to you, I thought this topic of diversity, which we are discussing quite a while, meanwhile, probably it's like with any other change activities, it's a little bit like change stories. If there is no real urgency or sense of urgency, maybe that's one of the reasons why the programs don't really work out as they should. So coming back to our company, and you were mentioning that a little bit, I think we are really, really ahead of with our technology, with our products, doing robots, doing automation, being into digitalization, being into these topics of Industry 4.0, being very, very well known on the market. So it's easy for us to get people. It's easy for us to get young people into the company. People are very good in what they are doing. So there is no real need to do that differently. That's how I was thinking about. Of course, we are doing all these programs like female networks when it comes to that, or inviting people to our top management events. So what I want to say is, I think as long as we are still getting people in, this is quite easy. Not to really to do what you need to do, or what is state of the art to be done, but not really to reflect it that much. So for example, we are very much struggling then when it comes to gender diversity. We are mainly looking for engineers, for software specialists, for data analysts. Difficult to find women in that area. What works out pretty well right now is when we are talking about young people. Obviously, it's easier to get young women into that kind of topics. So that's one, and then this is one of our challenges: having those young people, those digital generations, working then with the people who have not invented this topic. So that's one of our challenges. And the other reaction to what you were saying, which I think is a challenge for us as well, is the interface between exactly what you were saying, developing R&D, and then having the customer side on the other side. So really, when it comes to the topic of Industry 4.0, digitalization, Internet of Things, it's really about our engineers, our software architects, our R&D people having a lot of ideas how this could look like. Unfortunately, missing a little bit the customer view. Mm-hmm. Whereas on the other side, we might have the salespeople, the customer organization, knowing that the customers don't need it and all these kind of things. So I guess that's one of our challenges, bringing these diverse aspects together to create the new things out of it.
Mm-hmm. So thank you very much. I will just ask you to hand over the mic to Juliet. So what's your advice to your clients, and how is Deloitte actually living diversity?
Two good questions.
Mm.
So I think the starting point, and I think Annabelle, you made a really good point around training programs, because what I see with training programs is that people expect too much of them. You know, we have these great aspirations around diversity, and then we think we're going to achieve them by sending someone on a 2-hour training program. It's just not possible to really change a culture, to reset a culture, to reimagine what business is going to be like by just a 2-hour training program. But if we expect a training program to raise awareness, to create motivation for people to want to change, then maybe that's a realistic expectation. What I would see is that organizations originally started to be involved in diversity for compliance-based reasons. They had to do it. And then there was an argument that actually it's good for business and it's about attracting talent and keeping talent. And so they started to put more energy into it, but the energy was just programs and training. And that energy was delivered by someone sitting in HR. Actually, not even the HR leader. It was someone who reported a couple of levels to HR, and they had no budget. So completely impossible to achieve those outcomes. But where we are now, I think is quite exciting, and that's the reason that I agreed to come from Australia to Austria to speak about this, because your whole conference is devoted to diversity and resilience. I've never seen a conference in the world where business leaders are coming together and thinking about this from multiple angles. I was part of the forum just before this one on the sort of political forum, and journalists were talking about it, and amazing. So how then do we help leaders actually be the leaders of diversity? How do we get it to become leader-led instead of HR-led? And how do we even imagine a future in which it's just integrated into business? So I just wanted to pick up on that first point that you made, because I think it's the important one. We're not going to achieve change by 2-hour training programs delivered by someone who has no budget, who's sitting in the bottom of HR, and the change point is going to be making it critical for business leaders.
Thank you very much. So now, Jonathan, being male, you are clearly the minority on this panel. So how does it feel to be a part of a minority, and how do you handle it?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. Growing up, well, I grew up in South Africa, so being a white male in South Africa is quite an interesting experience, because you feel as a minority, as a white male. And I want to make 3 points with regards to what you shared, and then I'll get back to the question that Werner just asked me. I want to thank you for bringing up the definition of diversity, because as a philosophy PhD student, one thing we always do as a starting point is we try to define a term, and we look at how the term is used. And I'm somewhat surprised by how the term diversity is used, because I would argue that once you put 2 people in a room, you already have diversity, but that is oftentimes not the case. We have so many people in a room and we're not talking about diversity. And I would say that a challenge actually for innovation is not the lack of diversity, but rather an abundance of conformity. And I want to give an example about that point from a sports field, because when I was younger, I tried to become a professional soccer player, and now I'm working in the sports field where we're looking at talent development. And I was working with the German Football Federation, and we just had a very disappointing World Cup, as you all know. And the big discussion we had was obviously the topic about diversity, but on a different level, I was wondering what dimension of diversity we need in order to be successful, because I found that while we do have a lot of diversity in the German national team, the big discussion was actually about that we are raising template players in Germany, players that all play the same kind of style. That's why we didn't make it that far, I would argue. And that is a thing where the level of skill in diversity becomes very fascinating or becomes interesting, because the lack of variety in that aspect, I think, was one of the key things that was a big challenge in the World Cup. The second point I want to talk about is with regards to my background in South Africa, because when I went to school there, I had the pleasure of, we as the school had the pleasure of meeting Desmond Tutu, and we had a great discussion with him, and I was asking him about how we can move away from trying to enforce diversity to a point where we can embrace diversity. Because I feel that South Africa is a country with so much potential, and it's not using that potential because diversity is enforced rather than embraced. And the third point I want to make is a very positive example of a company that I had the privilege of visiting 2 years back, SpaceX in California. And I found that while there is a high degree of diversity in that company, diversity is not really the topic. The topic is about how all those different people can achieve a common goal. And I felt for the first time really in a company that diversity was transcended and was all about the bigger mission, and the goal became bigger than the self. And I just love to see all of us live in a world where we go after goals that are so meaningful and inspiring to us, that it's not about who gets the credit, it's not about who has the biggest ego, but it's about the goal, and it's about the overall objective that we can be proud of as the entire team and not as the individual.
So Annabelle, I think you want to directly respond to Jonathan.
Yes. Thank you. These are really inspiring words. But I would like to inject a little bit of, and I don't want to say cynicism, but I want to say perhaps realism in terms of what experience has taught me over the last 20 plus years. Obviously, organizations work very well when there is a collective goal. And without that, organizations just don't work well. But the existing organizations that we have today are very diverse. Most of the menial, low-paid work that needs to be done is being done by people who are either female or foreigners or both, or male coming from backgrounds which are not privileged. That work is being done, and we can talk to them about the beauty of forgetting the ego and about how wonderful it is to have a common goal. But in the face of a disparity in salaries, in job security, and in future economic prospects, those goals which are worthwhile are being instrumentalized in rather cynical ways. And therefore, I just think that understanding the divergent incentives of people at different strata of the organizations are essential to genuinely create a mission and a collective identity that works for everyone in a genuine way. And the problem with the lofty goals is that when they become propaganda and dogma, they actually have a backlash effect. And for example, we see that companies such as Walmart, which were sued in the United States for discrimination, they actually successfully defended themselves by saying, we are not a discriminating organization. Look, we have a statement about how diverse we are and how much we value it. As if having that as a label is good enough. So all I'm saying is that, and I don't want to sound like the bitter old lady here, but I want to, especially to the young generation, almost as if I was talking to me 20 years ago, I want you to have your eyes open about the realities of the workplace, which are often rife with exploitation and unfairness. And by the way, there are lots of white males that are being exploited in a very unfair manner. And so I just want us to somehow incorporate that into moving forward.
So I think this was for sure a very nice first round. I want to maybe we explore these issues a little bit later on, maybe closer to our topic, how diversity drives innovation. Annabelle, you introduced several aspects of diversity. You mentioned 4. The BCG study you cited, I think they distinguish between 6 different aspects of diversity. Maybe a question to all of you. Do you think all aspects of diversity are equally important for innovation success? Because now maybe for a couple of minutes we don't want to discuss diversity as being a prerequisite for, let's say, acting political correct or doing good. We now want to look at how to organization well in terms of innovation output. We can also later on have the discussion about the more philosophical background, but now stick with the topic we want to do well in terms of innovation. And are all these aspects of diversity equally important, or would you argue, no, some aspects are more important? How can we strike the balance here? And I asked also this question because many people discuss diversity and listen to diversity discussions, and the only association they get is that's about gender. And my personal opinion is that's definitely not true, but it's not my opinion, it's your opinion that counts. So maybe just take stock on this issue. Maybe Silvia, if you take over, please.
If I remember the question, yes. And I think the two ladies, they have much more experience in that. But basically, I think everybody of us knows that the more ideas get into a discussion, the better the result is becoming. I think every one of us knows that when talking about the next vacation, the more ideas you are venturing, the nicer the place might be. So I think that's something we all learned in the meantime. Would a company concentrate on every aspect of diversity? I don't know. I think what is important is to at least take it from the view on what is the market expecting. So who are the people that are deciding whether to go with Kuka or another company? How do they develop? Are they getting younger? Are they probably more and more women? So the way how they are making their decisions, that's something we should know within the company when developing our products, when selling our products. So I think basically in a company we need to reflect what is happening at our customer side. So bringing young people in, I guess anyhow is eye-opening, learning other ways how to think about things, bringing in people who can represent the aspect from a customer, from a buyer. I think that's at least a minimum perspective on how to look into how diverse a company needs to be.
So let me be a little bit controversial in this. I know you want controversy, so I'm going to leave. I'm going to go home to Australia. I'll never see you all again, so I'll be the one that's controversial. So when you're talking about I agree with you that there are good reasons to do diversity from all different angles because customers want to see that, potential employees want to see that. But if you're asking about innovation, the aspects of diversity that make a difference to that, the ones that I saw through other people's research were actually quite limited. So gender does make a difference to the dynamics, the behaviours that people have within a group. So it's relevant to eliciting diversity. Secondly, racial diversity makes a difference because it creates these curiosity behaviours and therefore elicits diversity of thinking. But actually age makes no difference. It's really, and that's what I mean by, so we think in a way that we should have people who are young in the group and people who are old in the group, and that is going to create diversity of thinking. But actually the research doesn't show that at all. So you might want to have age differences in a group for a different reason, but not for innovation. So you can have the same ideas coming out of different people. I think the thing that we're trying to get to is diversity of thinking. That's actually what creates the innovation. And those categorical differences of gender and race are the social cues that stimulate different behaviours with people. But diversity of thinking, for me, at least this is what my research shows, is that it's about people's different ways of solving problems. And I think there are 6 different ways to solve problems, and each of them are equally important, but those things are disconnected from someone's race, from someone's gender, from someone's age. There are lots of things that we have learned how to solve problems. So just let me give you one example of that. Yeah, so you might think, for example, that people who are actuaries might have a strong bias towards solving a problem from a risk perspective, because that's the nature of their job. Well, I tested that, and actually they don't. They come at it, well, this particular group I was working with, they came at it from an outcomes perspective. What are you trying to achieve? I'm trying to settle, trying to assess the quality of that risk and what I should pay for that risk. So it doesn't seem that people's, the work that they do is related to the way that they solve problems. Another example is I spoke to lots of people who were human resources directors, and I would have assumed that they would be very people-oriented, but they weren't people-oriented at all. They were very process-oriented. They're administering systems. So it's not how you think.
To connect 2 things, that's very interesting, and that's not only Juliet research that goes into this direction. Although the BCG study Annabelle was citing, I also came across it when I prepared for this evening, is quite similar. They found that the strongest correlation is between national diversity and industry diversity in a group and innovation outcome, and the weakest correlation is between age diversity and education diversity, with gender diversity and career path diversity somehow scoring in the middle. That means, regarding to their findings, the strongest impact, if we would assume causality would be impact, otherwise it's just correlation, would be national diversity in this context and industry diversity. That means bringing people with different national backgrounds and industry backgrounds together. And age diversity and education diversity has only very little effect in this study. And this nicely corresponds to what you found in your study. That is really interesting.
So I want to build on what you said and also bounce on what you were saying earlier about, which I thought was very interesting. You were saying there is too much conformity, right? So I think that's absolutely right. And sometimes when we speak about diversity, we do a shortcut going from basically identity politics. We are creating groups of people, women, blacks, young people, foreigners, and we somehow assume that within these groups there is some homogeneity within these groups. And we also assume that by mixing them up, like we make a cake, we're mixing ingredients, flour and eggs and sugar, there's going to be some sort of chemical reaction, which is automatic, just like when we mix ingredients. But perhaps there is an invisible part of that process that we should focus more on, which has to do with the flip side of this conformity, which is how do we educate people to genuinely listen to other points of view? How do we educate our own children to not only express their point of view confidently and persuasively, but not feel threatened when they hear something else, either feel threatened or simply switch off, because it's not something they're very used to hearing. Therefore, they don't quite understand where it's going, and therefore the effort of translation doesn't seem worth it. And there are some skills, I think, that we need to build for individuals, and also understand that the cultural influence of the corporations makes a big difference. In the course of my research, I have done research as well as consulting with a variety of corporations. And I would like to speak about 2 corporations that are at the 2 extremes on the spectrum. One was Intel Corporation, at the time where it was led by Andy Grove. Andy Grove was a Jewish refugee from Hungary who escaped from Hungary, went to America, and had a hearing defect, and came from a rather poor family, and made it all the way to the top of one of the most powerful corporations in America and in the world, called Intel. And he had kind of an abrasive style. And he fostered a culture within the corporation of what they called constructive confrontation. And I interviewed almost 80 people in the organization. And they were all saying that this is a corporation where we expect you, and you are expected to disagree, even with the boss, and that these disagreements are not only tolerated but encouraged. And it's on the basis of these various point of views that the strategic decisions were taken almost like in a tribunal. You want to hear the voice of the defense and you want to hear the voice of the prosecution, and then the top management makes the decision. On the other side of the spectrum, there was a company like Nokia, where in the Finnish cultural context, consensus was very highly valued. And if you would have a committee, even if there was one voice that was dissenting, the decision was not made and was postponed until everybody agreed. Now, some of these styles might be very adaptive and very good in some circumstances and not very good in other circumstances. But this is just to show that companies differ profoundly in which how they value disagreement, in which how they value or not value the expression of disagreement, and what they make with it. And so the point I want to make is different human beings, first of all, are not just defined by the group to which they belong, and also you don't mix different human beings like you mix an ingredient on a cake.
Yeah. So I think in order to answer your question, we really need to start thinking with the end in mind, because trying to figure out which dimension of diversity is most important, it always depends on the project or the goal we're working on. For example, you mentioned design thinking, and my PhD, I'm working on machine learning, and we're looking at correlations, how specific skills in sports, for example, help create better results. And in terms of that, I perfectly agree with you with what you said to diversity in thinking, and what I mentioned earlier as well is diversity in skills. Because it doesn't really matter that I'm the youngest on the team because I'm just 24 and some people are 40 and someone is from South Africa and someone else is from our team is from England and another person is from America and another person is from Russia, but who has which skills and how can we collaborate on those skills in order to create a great result? I just want to comment real quick on the topic of age, because you mentioned it, and although all the research seems to show that age doesn't really have a big impact, I find that, and I published a book on it and looked at, okay, how do younger generations deal with failures and setbacks, because I find that that is one of the key things when it comes to innovations. I think if we don't allow ourselves to fail and if we try to innovate, that the one thing doesn't work without the other. If we try to create new things, then we will fail inevitably. And from the research and the conversations that I was looking at, I found that the younger generations or the younger people tend to have a different approach when it comes to dealing with setbacks. I don't know if there's any correlations that are, or research that you looked at that showed that, but I just found that that was a key thing, looking at, okay, how do younger people deal with failures and how can that help in a innovative process?
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What are the differences? What are young people doing differently than my generation or our generation here?
Okay, so one key thing about our generation is that so I'm 24, that's usually described as the millennial generation, and we've got the generations still younger than that who are used to things being very quick, things being very fast. And that tends to lead to us not having a lot of patience, which is a bad thing, because I feel that if we really want to acquire a skill, we have to put in a lot of effort and it takes time. But on the other hand, the advantage, I would say, is that when we fail, we bounce back much easier. It doesn't hit us as hard. I would say it's more the American way of dealing with setbacks that came over to us Europeans, or even in Africa. I found that where a failure for us, it's not, okay, we failed and now we're broken. That's one thing that happened to my granddad, for example, who tried to build a business and he failed and he just never started again. And for us, if we fail, well, you know, failure for us is just one step to making it to, it's a learning process. And I would say that maybe we're just masters in failure and bouncing back.
Yeah, if this is really the case, then this would be a good thing. And it, by the way, nicely corresponds to the general theme of Forum Alpbach, this year, resilience. But this is more or less resilience. So this is also a nice example now how resilience and innovation might be related to each other. That if you want to be an innovator and if you want to go for radical innovation, then you will have to have your drawbacks and your failures, and if you're more resilient, then you're probably also more capable in starting to innovate again. So I think this was a nice reference also to our general theme here. But let us move on in our discussion to the next issue that I think is important to this topic. If you read about diversity, then some kind of, I would call them naive authors always give the impression the more the better, the more diverse, and even though balanced scorecards that count, the more diversity, the better the score is, the more money you will earn or whatever it is. Is it really that easy, Annabelle, that it's always the more the better? Or is there some kind of, I don't know, inverted U-shaped relationship between diversity and outcome? Does this differ for outcome dimension? Do we have to go to strike a balance? Or shall we just maximize diversity, then everything will be fine?
I think it's okay.
Does it work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Does it work? Yes. Yeah, so I think based on what we have already covered up until now, I think it's fairly clear that we cannot expect the more the better, simply for the reason that diversity is not one variable, right? So if we are framing this as the more the better, it would be as if you could shrink diversity into one variable, like heat or volume, and then you can yank it up. Whereas everything we've heard already shows that it's a variable that has many dimensions, right? So not only in terms of input of point of views, but we've also seen that a complementary capability has to be the ability to listen to each other and the culture of the organization. So already we see that when we speak about diversity, it's going to have to be a good fit between the culture of the organization, the skills of the individuals, and the ability to listen to each other. So all of that cannot be reduced into one variable. And the second point, which we have alluded to earlier in this group conversation, is that diversity reveals some inherent tensions. Some inherent tensions because when the organization is not carried by a hope of growth, say more room at the top, new markets, more budget and expansion, when the organization is operating in a worldview of scarce resources, and if in those situations, which do exist, bringing in diversity, just like in the BCG story, for example, means replacing existing jobs, taking these people out of their jobs, and putting new people from a different background instead, how is it possible that it will not create fear and demoralization and tension within group? There is another study from a professor at Harvard University that talks about ambivalence about culture, cultural ambivalence. So again, it's about the cultural tension that exists. So we need to know how to incorporate more diversity with an appreciation of the tensions it creates.
And I guess I would like to bring the element of leadership in here, because I would imagine that, what I can see is the more diverse the team is, the more different ways to think about things, the different ways on how to solve problems or whatsoever, different intentions people are having. I guess the more leadership skills or the better leadership skills are required to yeah.
I actually think there's a different style of leadership that is needed for diversity. And I mean, this is the research that I've been doing on leadership to date, is that a lot of leaders are relying upon the skills that they've developed in a homogenous workforce and thinking that that will work. But actually, inclusive leadership is the ability to adapt to a different person in front of you, and to hold that lightly, to hold yourself lightly. And it doesn't matter if you are changing yourself to make the other person feel more included. It's not changing your values, it's just changing your behaviour. So I think leaders learning how to create that their individual behaviour, but also how to create a culture in which everyone, as you say, listens to people. You know, people have a voice, they feel psychologically safe. You know, these are very new skills. So there's a piece of work that we did called the 6 signature traits of an inclusive leader. You can Google it, the 6 signature traits of an inclusive leader. And we found that when these leaders manifested these capabilities, individuals felt up to a 70% difference in their feelings of inclusion, and the team itself felt that they were performing better. So the team said about 25% we're more collaborative, about 25% we make higher quality decisions, and about 25% that the team is a high-performing team. And these were sort of new capabilities that led to these specific outcomes. But if you try and be a leader of a diverse team, doing the leadership you've always done, transformational leadership, authentic leadership, servant leadership, transactional leadership, all of those capabilities are not adapted for difference. They imagine homogeneity. Did you want to say something?
Yeah. Micro for a second. And isn't it also a challenging for leaders, because I think we all tend to like people who are somehow similar to us, who have same kind of personal characteristics, ways to deal with issues. So we all look more or less for lookalikes. Now, if you have a diverse workforce, you can by definition not only have lookalikes, because you have diverse people with different ways of acting and feeling. So I think it is much more demanding for leaders to actually bear the burden that they have people to lead who are quite different to what they would actually prefer to have. That's why I think it's easy for companies like, because you mentioned the example McKinsey, they, after a couple of months, they all look alike. It's easy to lead people. They all behave in the way you expect them to do, and you somehow think, hey, he's like me or she's like me, she's a good girl. He's a bad guy because he's completely different. Insane guy. Completely crazy ideas here, not complying to the style we are handling issues. So this is definitely much more demanding. But maybe a new generation can handle this easier. But Jonathan will tell us more about that.
No, I actually agree with you, because I think that having a sort of safety harbor, a safety net where you know that there's people who are alike, it helps you then to embrace new perspectives as a second step. But changing that around and bringing in a lot of different perspectives and having too much diversity as a first step, I would definitely wouldn't agree with saying, okay, the more the merrier. That is one thing, for example, that I think is one of the biggest challenges we face in South Africa. I have so many friends who run companies there who say that due to the enforced diversity they have there, it hinders progression, it hinders the level of innovation, because it's so hard getting your point across if there's so many different perspectives you have to fight against. Obviously, it is very important that you have different perspectives, which I find is one of the key things when it comes to diversity, but that safety net as a first spot where you feel, okay, you have commonality and then you bring in diversity, is one thing where I agree with all of you, despite being younger.
Annabelle.
One of the first big projects that our civilization know about is talked about in the Bible, and is the Tower of Babel, right? This was it was a mega project. It was a project to build a tower so big that it would reach the sky. So you could think of it as a super inspiring project, right? And everybody on earth was on board. And according to the story in the Bible, what caused the demise of this project was that God made people speak different languages. And because they spoke different languages, they couldn't understand each other. Whereas already from time immemorial, we know that what breaks big projects is the inability to listen to each other. Going back to your point about, is always more of it, better. And your point about the potential limits of too much diversity. I think there is a paradox here that we have to embrace two contradictory truths together. One is people have to be very secure in their identity in order not to feel threatened by others. How do you feel secure in your identity? If you grow with people who are telling you what your identity is and they mirror to you what your identity is. So identity is not just an individual characteristic, it's also a collective characteristic. So if when you grow up, you live in a family or within a community or within a country that has a strong sense of identity, you are going to grow up as an individual who are fairly sure that you are, say, an Austrian or a French person or something else, right? The more secure you are in your identity, if the values carried by your group are not values of alienation of others, and cultures differ in that, right? But if your culture is tolerant enough and open enough, then actually it makes you a good candidate to create bridges with other people, right? And so the paradox here is that you need to have a certain safety in your own identity in order to be able to bridge with other people. And I would suggest that the sort of breakdown of societies that we are witnessing just in the past few years, with Brexit, with a lot of doubt about the European Union, with the polarization within the United States between the red state and the blue state, and Trumpism versus liberal Democrats, and versus on campus lots of identity politics, comes from a failure to have recognized that all this multiculturalism has actually put the sense of psychological safety of a lot of people in danger, and there has been a backlash about that. So we need to be a bit less naive about it. We need to keep the ideals, but make them more realistic.
That means we need to be safe and have a strong identity to be open for working together and embracing. I like this notion of embracing diversity, but it's obviously not that easy and requires a strong personality, a strong character to actually being able to embrace diversity. Maybe another issue that also resonates with me, with your Tower of Babel example, that maybe diversity is good for having creative ideas, but this is also good for executing them. Wasn't the Tower of Babel an execution problem here? Maybe it's there's the correlation between innovation and diversity is strong and more positive between diversity and execution and efficiency of execution. Are you aware of any evidence in this respect?
It certainly is an intuitively appealing idea to say that when you are in the brainstorming idea, you need, and you can benefit from a variety of inputs, but once you are in the implementation idea, you need coherence. It certainly is intuitive, and I don't know of any studies to do that. I would, however, be a little bit circumspect as to whether we can really have periods of thinking and brainstorming and then periods of implementation. And what we seem to see in the current business cycles is that there is an acceleration of that cycle between strategy formulation and strategy implementation. And in particular, in the digital world, we seem to be in a lot of permanent beta testing and permanent reconfiguration of products and services. And software allows us to do this. So how much really do we have long periods of formulation and long period of implementation? I think that's an open question.
There is this idea of structural separation between exploration and exploitation. So maybe teams that are more actually focusing on the exploration side might look different in terms of diversity than teams are responsible then for execution and for exploitation.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me.
So we should do a study on that later on, Annabelle.
Pleasure.
Okay, so maybe before I ask you to bring in your question, so maybe now, because there are some raising hands now, we will stop our little discussion here and our top discussion on research and give you the opportunity to raise your question and make your comments. So here in the back, there are people with the micro around them. We have half an hour time, so sufficient time
Thank you very much. I won't need half an hour. My name is Wolfgang Meinig. I'm local here, so I can't say anything, and because I have to stay here. But I would like to draw the attention more on the basic assumptions going against diversity. Because most of all who are listening here to this session, we believe that diversity is a good factor. And I've been for a long time a bank manager, and I saw that what you called these template players are produced by management like that. And I just would like to draw one point into the discussion. It is maybe that a lot of our organizations search for predictability. And therefore, of course, you would like to have a certain kind of people in there. So I would like to ask that question again. What basic assumption, what values go against diversity in our companies at the moment so that we do not have more of it at the moment?
Yeah, Juliet.
So I made that mistake that diversity is the primary factor in terms of selecting people. But I made a mistake doing that, and I found out because then I asked these people to solve a problem and they couldn't solve the problem. The first thing is you've got to have basic capability. I don't want brain surgeons working on my brain if they don't know how to do brain surgery, but they look like a diverse group, right? I want people who are capable. So I'll take diversity after I take fundamental capability. And the other thing that I won't compromise on is values. I don't want diversity of values. Integrity is a very important value to me. So I don't want to employ someone who says, nah, integrity, I'm quite good at sort of theft, lying. I won't compromise on values. So I do think we can be, diversity is not a euphemism for anything goes. So for me, the two things, the person has to have capability and they have to have the values. And then I look at the diversity of the team. Yeah, it's my perspective.
Silvia, do you want to add? No.
It was a brilliant response. Absolutely. Yeah?
Okay, complete agreement. So no diversity in opinions here. So we move on to the next question, please. Please raise your hands. Okay, please.
Good evening. First of all, thank you very much for the interesting discussion. I was wondering, one point that I'm really missing in the conversation. This is the customer. Because at the end of the day, if we have even a little bit more female white boards, then we still have a bubble of the same people with the same social background, the same social class, discussing innovation for people they probably never encountered in their whole life. So how on earth should they have an idea which sort of products and services they need? So I'm really missing one point here, and this is, I think we see very much template innovation at the moment. So using design thinking will not solve this problem. I really think for truly innovative products and services, we need a completely different approach. We really have to go into the field with new methods and with a completely different approach to innovation to deeply understand what is going on into people's life and then come up with products and services the board has probably not ever dreamed of is possible, and then we can build truly innovative solutions. But therefore, I think we really have to get rid of this notion of the customer, which simply doesn't exist. And this is even not a target group or whatsoever. These are human beings, and as long as we stick to easy solutions like design thinking or whatsoever, this is just the beginning. So I think it's just not ambitious enough.
I think, Silvia, you referred to the importance of being close to the customer and the customer needs, and having diverse people means having people who know different types of customers, but maybe you can elaborate more on your opinion on that.
I think I'm very much referring to what you are saying. It's really about understanding the market, understanding what is going to happen in the future on the market, maybe not now, and yeah, I think there's various methods how to do it, but really going out, I think I couldn't say it better than you did, going out, understanding what is going on, what will be going on, and how to bring that to products that might be sold or should be sold, and that people, that help people, whatever their need is, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it okay if I quickly comment?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So I think that we actually did touch on that point a little bit. Why are you laughing? When we were talking about design thinking, because you obviously can do it with the client directly, but looking at the Google team who invented the sprint methods, they went out directly to the customers and they were looking at how they can invent products that directly serve the customer. And we're also using in our company those kind of sprints, innovates for design sprints, however you may want to call them, where I would say that a higher degree of innovation can be achieved as a result of that method. So I actually think that we were touching on that point, maybe not in an elaborate fashion.
Over here, next question, please.
Hello, I'm Nina. Thank you for your interesting thoughts. I'm a student in digital communication, and a few days ago I participated in the innovation marathon here at Forum Alpbach. And in 24 hours we needed to create a business model for Philips. And in those 24 hours I sat there with 5 students, all from different backgrounds, like a diverse test group, you would say. And we came up with something quite nice. I'm kind of proud of it. And but the day that we ended at 9 after 24 hours of working, and then we handed over like our ideas to Philips. But this discussion made me wonder, like, how valuable is it to create something outside a company for a company? Can innovation take place for a company when the workers within a company are not part of an innovation process? How valuable is that? That was my first thought. And the second one is the enabler for innovation, is that not, when we talk about diversity, isn't the most important thing the structure of a company? When you're an established company, doesn't that mean that you're done innovating? Thank you.
Joe, who wants to take this question? Okay, Juliet, great.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do at Deloitte to make that, we call it scaling from the edges. And we have what we call the center for the edge, because a lot of innovation in an established company does exist, but it happens at the edges of that. And you need to then wrap your arms around it, give people a sandpit to play in. But you're absolutely right. In established companies, it is very hard to do innovation if you don't take a very deliberate approach to it. And transforming organizations now, Deloitte needs to transform the way that it's working, and transforming an organization while you're running the organization is the hardest thing to do. So our strategy is to put love and attention around these innovations that happen on the fringe, and then once they've been incubated, to bring them into the center.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite business books is called How the Mighty Fall, and I just want to comment on the last remark that you mentioned with regards to once a company is established, they can't just stop innovating. And I think that is a great recipe for failure, because the moment you feel you are at your peak and the moment you feel you're at your greatest, that is the moment when you're most vulnerable. And also the moment when you stop reinventing yourself is also the moment when someone else will overtake you and will serve the customer in a much better fashion than you're doing it. So I don't think there's ever going to be a point where you say, okay, now I've made it and I can stop innovating.
Annabelle, I think you also want to add something to this.
Excellent question. There is a big movement called open innovation, which started in the early 2000s. There was a fantastic book by Professor Henry Chesbrough, who's now at Berkeley. And there are hundreds and hundreds of companies all around the world that have adopted those methods of trying to utilize innovation that originated outside the walls of the corporation. So practices such as hackathons, the types of workshops that you're talking about, innovation contests, platforms for innovations, this is becoming now more and more part of the norm, of part of the way companies innovate. This works better when the problem to solve is framed and described by the insider, and they know, and then they ask some precise questions to the outsider, as opposed to being able to incorporate ideas that are framed in a different language than the original. But about the second point you were making about, isn't it the case that once a corporation becomes established and it's got a sort of a solid structure, doesn't that mean by definition that they will not be able to innovate? But it turns out that evidence is very mixed about that. And even if in conventional wisdom, people tend to assume that it's only startups who innovate and big old companies are always dinosaurs, it's actually not the case. As a matter of fact, 9 out of 10 startups fail. And there are lots of existing incumbent companies that are able to reinvent themselves and to innovate, not just on products, but services, processes, markets. We have historical examples from 3M, even before DuPont, IBM, Eli Lilly, and lots of examples of successful companies that, even if they are old in history, were able to reinvent themselves. So there's just about as much failure on both sides, the startups and the new companies.
I think it's really important to underscore that, because many pictures are much too one-dimensional. The reality is much more nuanced and differentiated. And for example, Lego, the company that was mentioned 2 times already, is a very nice example of open innovation. They have a very powerful open innovation processes in place in most of the Lego plays we all know and buy for our kids. Actually were not invented by Lego employees, but from people outside in some kind of communities and crowds. Remaining questions, so please, go ahead.
Good evening, my name is Wolfgang. I'm an Austrian economist working in Brussels, and that brings me to my question, which is a bit more from a macroeconomic point of view. The European idea is united in diversity, and to me it seems that Europe is quite diverse. So from that point of view, Europe should be quite innovative, but most numbers show that other regions, other economies are more innovative than Europe is. So what's the deal with that? Is Europe maybe not as diverse as it likes to be, or are there other mechanisms preventing innovations in Europe from this macroeconomic point of view? Would be very interested in your take on this issue.
This is definitely a great question. I'm really happy that I don't have to give an answer here, but you will do. So that's our division of labor. Huh? You're posing the question, I pass them on to you. You have to find the answers now.
I can say a very quick thing. I'm not going to talk about innovation in general. I'm going to talk about the area that I know a little bit about, which is digital platforms. Right? So digital platforms, we know about Google, we know about Facebook, we know about Amazon, we know about Apple. They're all American companies. Now, the other big platforms in the world come from China. We've got Tencent, we've got Baidu, we've got Alibaba, JD.com. And big platforms in Europe, well, the reason we don't know about them is because we don't have a lot of them. Now, if you look at the number of customers or potential customers in Europe as a whole, is fairly similar to the number of potential customers in the United States. However, and there is this project called the Digital Single Market, trying to solve that problem. And in this particular case, the problem is not a lack or an existence of diversity. It's a problem of harmonization of business rules and technical standards across the diverse geography of Europe in order to allow scale to happen. So it actually is a problem of lack of harmonization. For this particular case, it's not so much the problem of innovation of the idea, because a lot of the ideas about, a better search engine, a better, music web application were originated in Europe. But because of either lack of funding and or lack of possibility to scale in terms of internal market, these companies migrated to the United States.
Yeah, I was just wondering, probably diversity also needs kind of, structure or you need to use the diversity that is there. That reminds me, there is quite a lot of companies having, when talking about gender diversity, a high amount of women in the company. You also need to get them to make decisions, to bring in the different perspectives. Maybe Europe is a little bit similar like that. We have to use the different perspectives.
Thanks. I can't comment directly on Europe, but what I would say is that the presence of diversity without a culture of inclusion is meaningless. There's no point. It's just like having a paper that I wrote on it years ago was called "Waiter, is that inclusion in my soup?" And what I was trying to do with that is show that you can have all of the ingredients for a soup sitting side by side, dry ingredients, and it's not a soup. It's just dry ingredients. And so I wonder if, Europe is really fostering a culture of inclusion. And it seems to me, not just Europe, but, the US, Australia, UK, everyone at the moment has retreated back to their tribal groups. So rather than moving forward to, there's a sign of the balcony here that, it's about connection, whereas a couple of days ago the sign was protection. I don't know if you saw the sign. Until we're really going to embrace inclusion, then we're just going to have tribal groups at war with each other. That would be the worst scenario, or tribal groups just sitting next to each other, not even talking. Yeah. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, so you can clap if you want. So I got 2 points for you. One is from a startup entrepreneur perspective, and one is from my PhD thesis perspective, because I'm very much looking into businesses in emerging technologies, especially in artificial intelligence, because that is my topic. And with almost everyone involved in that field, they always talk about the 3 different camps. One is America, one is China, and one is Europe. And our need for, we have so many restrictions here in Europe that slow down the speed of innovation, because things that you can do in America, that you can do in China, we just have rules and regulations that don't allow us to use data, for example. And for artificial intelligence, the key ingredient you need is data. So that is one aspect. And the other point, Annabelle, you already mentioned, when it comes to funding. When I talk to Americans at conferences about my startups and my objectives and my fundraising goals here in Germany or in Europe, they laugh. They laugh because they say, okay, with the amount of money you want to raise, how do you expect to compete with us or with the Chinese? And looking at the venture capitalist funds and the money that is poured into startup companies, it's just very insignificant what funds we have available in Europe in comparison.
But why are we, don't we have the fund or the potential is in Europe? It's because we are fragmented. So if I may just add one of my thoughts regarding this, obviously, I think it's a great question. Diversity obviously needs coherence. I think, as you mentioned, cultural inclusion. Diversity without coherence is actually not leading to working organizations. And this is probably one of the issues of the European Union, that we have a lot of diversity in opinions and interests, but we lack coherence, we lack some kind of shared cultural identity. This is also refers to the identity concept, I think. And this potential of diversity cannot be utilized without coherence. And coherence would mean to overcome this fragmented situation that has many, many downsides in all different areas. You just mentioned one of it, funding, for example, scaling businesses. It's much easier in the US because they're not fragmented. So we've got time for one last question.
I'm the founder of Kulturenreich. We are an association of women, foreign-born women in Vienna. We support other high-skilled women. Some say migrants, some say some want to be expat, but at the end we decide to be foreign-born in Vienna to become professional, successful, and financial independent. Now, I want a tip from you. Our CVs of brain surgeons get automated, selected for their diversity. How can we cope with the prejudice of predictability?
I'm not sure if I got, did you understand the question? So we support women to find jobs in Vienna.
Yes. They're not born in Austria. German is not their mother tongue, but they are high skilled. Most of these ladies, while they search their first job or second or third, it takes like between 3 and 5 years to find a fulfilling job in Vienna for a woman not born in Austria. Their CVs get automated, selected, even though they are brain surgeons. From their diversity. And there are companies...
This is the assumption you're making.
No, it's not an assumption. No. This is our fact. We are facing this situation all the time. And on the other hand, the companies want predictability. So how can we cope with this?
Any ideas here?
It was your assumption.
Yeah, the problem is not yours to cope with because you're just the recipients of it. The problem is that there's bias in the selection, and that your experience is the same experience in New Zealand, it's the same experience in Australia, and all those studies say the same thing, and that is that, and it's to your point, people select people who are like themselves. put a question mark over someone's qualifications if those qualifications were gained overseas, because they don't really what did they do at that university? And so your colleagues are up against it. And the only thing that seems to be making a difference in that is when organisations have blind CVs, when they take off any identifying details and just focus on the capabilities of the person. So your people, your compatriots, can't solve the problem. It's for people like me in my organisation, leaders of processes, who have to rectify it. I'm sorry for it.
But it's time to talk now about cultural sense, not common sense, because we keep talking about common sense, and common sense makes common only when we are, like you said, from one entity, from one tribe. But then we have to start talking about cultural sense, because the common sense, what we expect, it's not anymore it's up to date.
Yeah, I agree. It's fundamental. We need to change. I absolutely, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry, but you're right.
Thank you.
Any remaining questions, comments? So really the last one over here, then we will finish up on time.
Thank you very much. My question regarded a little bit more resilience. And I was thinking now about sustaining innovation, about disruptive innovation, not sustaining innovation. And I think it also applies to when mentoring blue markets, blue ocean strategies. How do you realize when you need to stop a project or continue being resilient and trying to push it further on? Speaking more about startup companies or innovative ideas.
Okay, so not throwing good money after the bad money or that's already lost. Okay, who wants to take this question? Jonathan knows about throwing good money after bad money.
It's a challenging question because I think every or most startups face a point where they feel, what are we doing here and why, like what's our reason for existence? And I mentioned one of my favorite business books, which is How the Mighty Fall, and now I tell you my all-time favorite, and that's The Hard Thing About Hard Things, because I find that the author Ben Horowitz describes the inner life of a startup, and especially the CEO of the startup, to an extent that I haven't found before. And he basically says that all CEOs that he's ever spoken to, and he built one of the largest VC funds, he just said that all CEOs he interviewed who made it don't say, okay, I made it because I've got so many skills, but they made it because they stayed longer in the ring than anyone else thought was wise. And I can't give you a perfect answer for like that works for all different kinds of startups, but I found that when the why is clear enough, the how is easier to bear, and you will find ways of pulling through if what you do is meaningful enough and actually serves a purpose. And then I found that the highest correlation between resilience in startups is the purpose behind it, the reason why you're in it. And if that's not strong enough, you'll probably don't work through the really hard and ugly phase. And mostly after that, after you went through that phase, that's when it becomes light again. But that's just...
Please, yeah.
So I have a practical, so I had a startup, I had it for 12 years before I came into Deloitte as a partner. I sold my startup into Deloitte. That's how I became a partner in Deloitte. My practical tip, apart from I agree with you around, being mission driven and all of those things, was actually to set money aside for the bad days. And so every invoice that we had, right from our first invoice, we set aside 20% of it. And that's really hard to do when you're making no money at all. 20% of no money is not very much. But we did it right from the beginning. And so what it meant is that we always had a financial buffer behind us. And that was really important for when we went through the financial crisis. And so I went through the financial crisis, and we nearly went to the wall in the financial crisis. We were 3 months away from going under. And in that moment, we had the money that we had saved, and then we just started to pull money back again. The partners in the business took 30% pay cuts. The staff in the business all took 10% pay cuts. So you've got to watch your numbers. And then we got out of it and we paid everyone back. But it's really important to have a financial buffer so that you can be financially resilient, because you can have all the purpose in your life that you like, and you can have all the good energy, but if you can't pay your staff, they're all leaving. So financial resilience is key, and that just means don't spend too much.
Mm-hmm. So, I think this was a nice question, also referring back to the general theme of this forum, how resilience and innovation are related to each other. I think it's later than 9:30 now. I think we should first of all thank our great panelists. I think this was really a fascinating, highly interesting discussion, so thank you very much. I think you provided us with many very interesting and noble insights, but also 5 of us are very grateful and thankful to you that you invested so much time and energy at this point of time. So it really was a pleasure for us having you as our audience, and we all wish you a nice and pleasant evening now, and I hope you have some food for discussion now wherever you are heading. This should be a highly diverse and pleasant evening to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us.